All right, welcome to the final um, section of Section 5. And so today we're going to discuss the women's rights movement pretty much exclusively throughout the entire lesson. So there's going to be many early calls for women's rights, and this is mainly due because women had very few political or legal rights in the mid 1800s. They could not vote or hold office, and they won't be able to vote until 1920, sorry, with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Women also had a problem when they married, their husbands would become the owner of all their property. So if a woman owned property before she was married, as soon as she became married, her husband would then own all her property and she would cease to own that property any longer. Also, if a woman worked outside her home, like let's say in a factory, her wages would then belong to her husband to spend as he saw fit and not as what she wanted to do with them. So these are going to be a lot of the problems that women will have to deal with throughout the 1800s and continue on for quite a while, believe it or not. And as women join the abolitionist movement, they will realize that they lacked full social and political rights themselves. So, because their involvement in the abolitionist movement, they're going to start the women's rights movement as well, because they're going to realize that they just don't have the same political rights that they feel they should have. And so both white and African American abolitionists, men and women, would join the struggle for women's rights. So Sojourner Truth, she was born in slavery in New York, and after gaining her freedom, she would come to believe that God wanted her to fight slavery. And she would travel the United States spreading the truth about the evils of slavery as being ridic- as well as ridiculing the idea that women were inferior to men. So Sojourner Truth not only was part of the abolitionist movement, but she was also an early contributor to the women's rights movement as well, trying to dispel that idea that women are inferior to men and that they are actually equals. And so Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton will also be abolitionists that are going to start turning to the cause of women's rights. And these two will be the most influential members of the women's rights movement for a period of time. And so Mott was a Quaker and the mother of five children. She was originally from Pennsylvania. And she was a quiet speaker, but she was very persuasive and also organized petition drives across the North. And she'll be very influential with how she does these things. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was also the daughter of a New York judge. And by being the daughter of a judge, she was born into a very prominent family. So she's going to be able to use her family name to basically further the cause of women's rights. And so she'd be an excellent student growing up, as well as a very good athlete. And her biggest problem, though, her father would not encourage or really support her much throughout her campaign for equal rights for women. And both women would attend a series of classes in Boston known as conversations. These conversations were women only um, meetings that would be held. And so they would basically start to discuss the early tendencies and movements of the civil rights, or sorry, not civil rights movement, but the women's rights movement. And in 1840, Stanton and Mott would join a group of Americans at a World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. However, the convention officials refused to let women take an active part in the proceedings. And as you guys probably read, women were actually forced to sit behind a curtain and were not even heard from or really acknowledged a whole lot at this meeting. And this is going to have a major impact, you could say, on both Mott and Stanton. And so after returning home, Mott and Stanton will take up the cause of women's rights as a result of how they were treated at this convention. So even in London, Mott and Stanton had begun to think about holding a convention in the United States to draw attention to the problems that women faced. So the whole point of the convention that they want to hold in the United States is to start drawing attention to their problems. And so the meeting is what will start in the women's movement, and this will take place in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. And I will be attaching a link in the description of this video for you to another YouTube video that goes a little bit more in depth into the Seneca Falls Convention. So, At the Seneca Falls Convention, there'll be many different views on suffrage. And remember, suffrage is the right to vote. So about 200 women and 40 men will attend the Seneca Falls Convention. And Stanton's greatest contribution to the convention would be the Declaration of Sentiments, which she wrote. And so in this Declaration of Sentiments, she'll model them after the Declaration of Independence, especially with how things are worded in saying that all men and women are created equal instead of Jefferson's words of all men are created equal. And so the delegates will approve of the Declaration. And the men and women at Seneca Falls will vote for resolutions that demand equality for women at work, at school, and at church. So this is going to be where you start to see the whole equality in the workplace, equality in education, and equality in church life, which was very important to them back then, um, all starting to emerge. And only one resolution will meet any opposition at the convention, though, and that will be that women should be allowed to vote. And this will be the most controversial point at the convention. And in the end, though, the resolution will very narrowly pass. So people did agree that women should be allowed to vote, but it was very, very highly contested. And so the Seneca Falls Convention will mark the start of an organized campaign for equal rights, or the women's rights movement as it will become known. And this movement was one of the most important reform movements of the Reform era. So the women's rights movement is really what's going to be kind of the highlight of this whole Reform era that we've been talking about. And new leaders will start to take up the struggle. Susan B. Anthony will build a close working partnership with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And Susan B. Anthony, don't forget about her because we will be talking about her later on, especially in when we start high school history, your sophomore year. And while Stanton had to stay at home with her 7 children, Anthony, who didn't have any, was free to travel across the country, and she was a very tireless speaker. So she would go out, travel the country, and basically spread the word about the women's rights movement. And Anthony would be repeatedly arrested for trying to vote during her time as part of the movement. And in the years after 1848, women will work for change in many, many areas. Um, And so they will win additional legal rights in some states, but still, many men and women oppose the women's rights movement. So, well, a lot of people were helping to bring about change for women. A good chunk of those people also still oppose the women's rights movement. And so the women at Seneca Falls will believe that education would be a key to equality. And such an idea was kind of controversial, especially in the early 1800s. So women are going to come to the conclusion that if we want to improve our place in society, we need to become better educated. Women from poor families at the time had very little hope of learning even how to read. So in the early 1800s, if you were from a poor family, women wouldn't even learn how to read, and most men in those families also didn't know how to read. If you're from a middle class family, though, girls who went to school would learn dancing and drawing rather than science or math. So yeah, you might learn how to read and write a little bit, but for the most part, you're going to be taught how to dance and draw and do more feminine things rather than the manly things like learn math and science. And after all, people argued women were expected to care for their families. So the stereotype of a woman was basically to be seen and not heard. And her role was to take care of the house, raise the kids, and make sure everything on the home front was running smooth. Well, the husband went out, made money, and made every important decision for the family. So, education opportunities will start to increase. The greatest impact of the women's movement in the mid 1800s was the creation of greater opportunities for women in education. So, early 1800s, there was very little chances for women to actually receive a good quality education. That will change later on in the mid 1800s. Emma Willard will open a high school for girls in Troy, New York, where women will study men's subjects such as math and physics. And this will be really important because the more they know about these things in these men's subject areas, they will be able to find better jobs and become more influential. Mary Lyon also opened the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in 1837. So she did not call the school a college because many people at the time thought it was wrong for women to actually attend college. So She would not. She basically called it a seminary instead of calling it a college. This was done basically to make people happier. And so Mount Holyoke would go eventually go on to become one of the first women colleges in the United States. So, new employment opportunities for women. At this time, a few men's colleges began to admit women as their education improved, and women found jobs in teaching. So, the stereotypical job outside of factory work for women was basically to become a teacher. And remember, we talked about yesterday how colleges are going to be start to be created specifically trained to teach women, or not necessarily women, but to teach people how to become teachers. And so women will enter fields such as medicine, astronomy, and they become editors and also ministers. So these are all going to be brand new job opportunities for them. However, the struggle will still continue for women's rights, even today, as in the 19th century, we're talking. Um, Different groups will have very differing points of view. And so these problems from the 19th century or the 1800s, in other words, might be different than the problems they have today, but the women's rights movement still continues on today a bit. One issue in which women's groups differ today is whether companies or the government should be required to pay women on maternity leave, or well, when you have a baby, should you be able to take like 60 days to 90 days off of work to care for your newborn child? Some women groups today, such as the National Organization for Women, will believe that employers, including the government, should be required to pay women during maternity leave. So, in other words, when you take those days off, you should be able to get paid automatically for your maternity leave. They argue that women need this support, and they kind of do. And other groups, such as the Independent Women's Forum, will argue that requiring employers to pay for maternity leave might make them less willing to hire men. So, on the other side of it, the Women's Forum, they're looking at it as well, if their businesses are required to pay women maternity leave, why would they want to spend extra money because they're going to hire women that could eventually become pregnant and then have to pay them this extra money to not work? So, there's going to be a lot of different arguments going back and forth on these different issues. And there's many more issues in society today that women also have to deal with that most others don't. Um, so this is the end of section 5. And tomorrow for your homework, you are going to be reading and outlining chapter 7, section 6. Um, for the most part, I will be assigning an online quiz for you to complete after you do your notes. Um, I'm not gonna do a PowerPoint over it, and we will be having an open book test, which means you can use your book and you can use your notes. We'll be having that on Thursday via Google Forms. So what I'm going to do for that is on my web page, you'll click on the assignment for that day. It'll say Chapter 7 test. You click on that, and there will be a Google Forms link. Copy and paste that link into your browser. It'll take you right to the page, and make sure you complete that. And so once you have that done, that is your homework for the day. We will not have any class or assignments on Friday, and I will be back again with another assignment for you guys that following Monday, which I believe is the 13th. Just make sure you double check my website going forward. It will have all your homework there for you, as well as videos and what's going on. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to email me.